So now what we're going to do is look at different situations where there will be discontinued funding. And for a variety of explanations and a variety of circumstances. So the first situation of discontinuing funding is if your funding has been regular but not essential. All right, it's an important distinction. Let's take the simplest process. You make an annual alumni gift to your alma mater, right? Most people make an annual alumni gift, which is a nice gift depending on what they can afford, but not enough that the university is going to stand or fall on the basis of your annual gift. There are a small number of people for whom that's not the situation. But for the vast majority of alumni, if there's a discontinuation of a gift that's been regular, could have been every year since you graduated, but for whatever reasons you decide to stop, you have no legal, moral, or ethical obligation to somehow say, make good on that, right? Because the institution is not depending on your funding, or a project is not depending on your funding. Now, if you're a significant enough player and you want to explain why you're not going to be funding it any longer, that's a fine thing to do. But other than that, you want to stop funding, you can stop funding immediately. You know, if you've made a commitment, you want to pay off your commitment. But after that, there's no situation that has any special claims on continuing your dollars. However, let's look at the next situation. Suppose you're funding a project and it's your feeling that the project has not reached its potential. But not because the organization hasn't tried, but frankly for whatever reasons. There could be many reasons. There could be a reason that something external in the world meant that people's attention changed. It could be that a competitor comes along, another community center comes along and beats you to the punch. It could be that the key staff person, who was really a unique key staff person, decided to up and take a job in another place, and there was no way for the organization to get the right kind of person in place. But for whatever reason, it's not because of the intention of the grantee that they couldn't do it, but there's a recognition that they're just not going to accomplish what the goal is. So in that situation, and with consultation, with discussion with the grantee, it's okay to discontinue the funding, assuming that the grantee says, yes, there's nothing we can do. It's really not, we can't accomplish what we want to do. Except for one situation. You can discontinue the funding except for the part where the grantee has made obligations based on your grant. So for example, suppose the organization has rented a space and has a rental obligation that lasts for a year. They're still going to have to pay for that. They did it on the basis of the assumption that the grant was going to cover that expense. Or there was a salary or something else along those lines. But if the nonprofit has incurred obligations on the assumption of our funding, we have an obligation to continue that funding until the end of that contract period. Because there's no reason to. It wasn't because of the fault of the nonprofit that they weren't successful. You both agree to that. And the key line here, and we're going to come to this later in the course as well, don't punish failure. Failure is legitimate in the funding scheme of things. Well-intentioned failure is a perfectly appropriate part of our funding experience. So you don't punish failure. You honor your obligations. The next circumstance where you might want to discontinue funding is a trickier one. What if the organization has failed to live up to what it claimed it wanted to do? Okay. Now, sometimes circumstances change and they thought it was just an incidental change, whereas you look at it, it is a qualitative change or a substantive change, a change of direction. But if you feel that it was willful and they did it knowingly, and they had never talked to you about it, then you might decide to discontinue funding immediately. Now that's a punitive thing to do. And you don't want to do this too readily, but I have to tell you, as a funder, when I was heading the foundation, subsequently as an individual funder, there have been a couple of times, not too many, I want to be clear, not too many, but there are a couple of times when grantees essentially were not straightforward about changes they made in how they used the money that was given. All right? In most of the time you find out about it too late to discontinue funding, but obviously you're not going to renew any grants. But if there are circumstances where you discover it along the way, and it's unfortunate when that happens, then it's legitimate to discontinue the funding. what I would rarely recommend, there are a few times, and this, you have to go to lawyers about this, I would not advocate trying to claw back money that's already been given. There are legal circumstances where maybe you would want to do that, but I'm recommending that that's a last circumstance. There's not much to be gained from that. There's a whole, if you have questions for Don, at some point in the legal presentation, you can ask him about that. But generally speaking, clawing back is not a useful way to penalize the nonprofit, but discontinuing the funding immediately is something that you can do if you really are convinced it was willful. This last one is not based on any experience of the grantee, but based on your own experience. Going back to what I said at the beginning, what happens if your funding disappears? What happens if it turns out there was a major recession, such as we had in 2008, 2009? Some of you in the course weren't doing funding in those days, but some of you have been, and you were, and recognized that it was a major recession in the United States and elsewhere in the world. People just did not have as much money to give. And so that's a situation where lots of funders had to make decisions about what to do to their grantees. Are there ethical ways to discontinue when in fact it has zero to do with the results of the grantee, zero to do with the quality of what's being performed on the other hand, zero to do with the intention or the good work of the grantee? What are our responsibilities in those circumstances? Okay. So the circumstance, the first situation is where we have funded the organization, a project or the organization for a while. For a continuous amount of time, I don't just mean 1 year, but a project, they count on us. We've been doing it for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, and they know every year on January 1st there's a check to continue that project. You never raised a question about it. You never had a concern about it, and you still don't have a question about it. Suddenly, for all sorts of internal reasons, you can't fund it anymore. In those circumstances, what we would recommend is that you advise the grantee as early as possible that there will be a change in funding. We also recommend in those circumstances that there be a phase-out grant over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, different organizations. But we would recommend, if it's really been a long-term project and it's been dependent on that one way or another you phase it out over 2 or 3 years at least, so that the organization can find other ways to support it, or even if it has to close it, can phase it out in a responsible kind of way. Even if there's no legal obligation because you've already fulfilled your grant obligations in writing, nevertheless, there is an ethical obligation to that organization to phase out your funding in that kind of way. As I say, usually a 2 to 3 year phase out. Okay. If it turns out that you really are committed to that organization, committing that project, you may also step forward and help them convene other funders. You may want to play the role of convener, which is a very important role that we can play as funders. Even when we can't continue funding something, even when we don't fund everything, we can call other funders. We can bring them together. We can arrange for visibility for that organization or for that project, so that there are other funders that can step into what we can no longer fund. So that's a situation where there are legitimate expectations on us if we're going to be responsible funders and we're phasing out, we're discontinuing our funding. So bear that in mind, because we always want to be ethical and responsible funders, because organizations depend on us. They develop programs based on what we give, and we want them to succeed. We're going to come back to this later on toward the end of the class, but I just want to say it now, that we want to do everything possible for projects and organizations that we fund to succeed. Our job is not to see how little money we can spend. Our job is to spend our money in such a way that the things that we care about, that they're implementing, have the greatest likelihood that they're going to accomplish what we both want to accomplish. And that means we want to always act ethically, responsibly, thoughtfully, and planfully. Okay. So in conclusion, here's some ground rules that I think that are useful for all of our funding. And you'll see when you think about these ground rules, you realize why this entire presentation on exit strategies is such a useful way to organize all of our grant-making decisions. because it incorporates so much of what we've covered in the course and so much of the decision making that we have to have depending on what our priorities are, depending on which way we like to do funding, depending on what our long-term expectations are. There are ways of forcing us and allowing us, encouraging us to think ahead so that we can accomplish what we want to do. Now remember, grantees only know what we expect if we tell them. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But you know as well as I do that there's lots of funders that assume that a grantee is supposed to intuit what's going to make us happy. Now, all I can tell you is going back to where I began the presentation, when I told you all of the people who were clients who would complain that somehow there was something about the way they did the grant making that didn't satisfy them, that wasn't gratifying. Invariably, upon close examination, was because they never articulated that to the grantee. They assumed that the grantee was somehow going to intuit what was going to be necessary to produce. What did they have to send them? How often did they have to invite them? What kind of reports did they want? Whatever it may have been, since they never articulated that, it put the grantees in this impossible no-win situation of having to intuit. We have an obligation to articulate if we have expectations. Now, let's be clear. Nonprofit organizations also have a right and to say no. If our expectations are disproportionate, we're giving a $10,000 grant and we want monthly financial reports from a small startup organization, that's counterproductive and disproportionate to what we're doing. And so that we have to somehow establish expectations where there's appropriate and proportionate kinds of expectations. Another real life case I'm going to tell you about, a foundation that gave money to a big project. When we talk about endowments and buildings, we'll come back to this example. But the case was that in the contract about giving endowment money to build a world headquarters of a big organization, hidden in the small print was a statement that the foundation had the right to review all publications for its approval before it went out. It's just inappropriate by any standard. If what they meant to say, we don't know what they meant to say. If they meant to say how their name was used as one thing, but to somehow say that all public publications had to be run through the foundation was an overreach that was ethically inappropriate and undoable. And fortunately, this nonprofit had a lawyer that picked up on that and called the foundation on it, and the foundation backed off. There are times when the foundations make inappropriate demands. We as funders have to make appropriate demands, and our grantees have to be willing and feel comfortable to say no to us if our demands are disproportionate or inappropriate. The earlier we establish expectations as funders, the earlier that we tell the grantee what it is that we want, how involved we want to be, what engagement we're going to want to have, what deliverables are going to be part of our expectation, what financial expectations are going to be there and that they can expect from us, and therefore what reports we can expect from them. The earlier we establish those relationships, the earlier we establish those expectations, the much greater the likelihood is that both sides, we as funders and the grantees that we fund, feel that this was a successful enterprise and has brought credit and gratification to both of us. So I'll see you in the class. Thanks a lot.